In a city of millions, the easiest thing to be is invisible. Claire knew this better than anyone. By night, she wore a crisp uniform and carried a silver tray, navigating a world of impossible wealth where she was seen by no one. To the guests at the lavish parties she served, she was less than a ghost. She was just a pair of hands offering champagne. But this is not a story about being invisible. It's about the one person who looked past the uniform and saw the woman holding the tray, and in doing so, changed the course of her life forever. The party was on the 80th floor of a skyscraper that pierced the New York City skyline. From the service elevator, Claire could see the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. For a moment, it was beautiful. Then the doors opened to the ballroom, and the illusion shattered, replaced by the familiar pressure of another night of work. The room was a symphony of excess. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music drowned out by the boisterous laughter of men in tuxedos and the clinking of glasses held by women adorned in diamonds. Claire grabbed a tray of champagne flutes, the cool metal a familiar weight in her hands. Her mission was simple: blend in, serve, and disappear. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her steps silent on the polished marble floor. She offered a glass to a woman who was mid-laugh, her hand snatching the flute without a glance. She approached a man who was pontificating about the stock market. He took a glass while continuing his monologue, waving her away with a flick of his wrist as if shooing a fly. This was her reality, a world where she was a function, not a person. She had learned to build a fortress inside her mind, a quiet place where their indifference couldn't touch her. She focused on the details, the weight of the tray, the chill of the glasses, the path she needed to take through the throng of bodies. It was a survival mechanism. But tonight, the fortress was cracking. A group of young men, their faces flushed with alcohol and privilege, caught her eye. As she passed, one of them deliberately stuck out his foot. Claire stumbled, the glasses on her tray rattling dangerously. She managed to save them from falling, her heart hammering in her chest. The man erupted in laughter. "Watch it!" one of them sneered. "This suit costs more than your entire life." Claire felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but the words were caught in her throat. A single word could cost her this job, a job she desperately needed for her mother's medical bills. So she did what she always did. She straightened her back, fixed a neutral expression on her face, and walked away, the sound of their laughter following her like a shadow. In a room full of people, she had never felt more alone. Claire retreated to a quiet corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows, pretending to rearrange the glasses on her tray while she tried to compose herself. The city lights below seemed to mock her, a dazzling world she could see but never touch. The laughter of the men still echoed in her ears, a cruel reminder of her place in this glittering ecosystem. She was used to being ignored, but the outright malice was harder to swallow. It chipped away at her resolve, making the professional mask she wore feel heavier with each passing hour. She took a deep, shaky breath, reminding herself why she was here, for her mother, for her brother. Their faces were the anchor that kept her from being swept away by the tide of humiliation. As she stood there, lost in her thoughts, she felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a feeling of being watched, not with the casual disdain she was used to, but with a focused, quiet intensity. She slowly lifted her head and scanned the room. Her eyes landed on a man standing alone by a far window, looking out at the city. He was tall, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored dark suit that stood in contrast to the flashier attire of the other guests. He wasn't talking or laughing. He was just observing. As if sensing her gaze, he turned his head slightly and their eyes met across the crowded room. Claire's breath caught. His gaze wasn't invasive or judgmental. It was calm, perceptive. It felt as if, in that brief moment, he saw past the uniform, past the tray, and looked directly at her. The connection was so unexpected that she immediately broke eye contact, her heart starting to beat for an entirely different reason. She convinced herself she was imagining it. It was probably a trick of the light. Or perhaps he was just another bored guest looking for a distraction. She busied herself again, collecting empty glasses, her movements now a little less steady, but she couldn't shake the feeling. Every so often, she would risk a discreet glance in his direction. He was no longer looking at her, now engaged in a quiet conversation with an older gentleman, but the memory of his gaze lingered. For the first time all night, she didn't feel completely invisible. She wasn't sure if that was a comfort or a threat. In a world that had taught her that being unnoticed was the safest way to be, being seen was a terrifying and unfamiliar prospect. As she continued her rounds, Claire tried to push the memory of the man by the window from her mind. But it was like trying to ignore a single, clear note in a cacophony of noise. She found herself acutely aware of his presence, a quiet anchor in the swirling chaos of the party. Her path eventually led her back toward the group of young men who had tripped her earlier. They were louder now, their arrogance amplified by several rounds of drinks. As she approached to clear their empty glasses, one of them, the same one who had mocked her suit, grabbed her wrist. "Hey, waitress!" he slurred, a smirk on his face. "You never did give us a smile." Claire froze, the tray in her other hand trembling. "Please let go of my arm, sir," she said, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the panic she felt inside. "What's the matter? Too good to smile for us?" he taunted, his grip tightening. His friends laughed, enjoying the spectacle. Claire's mind raced. Screaming would get her fired. Pulling away might cause a scene. She was trapped, her professional invisibility shattered, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She closed her eyes for a brief second, bracing for the humiliation to continue. "I believe the lady asked you to let her go." The voice was calm, yet it cut through the drunken laughter with the authority of a blade. Claire's eyes snapped open. It was him, the man from the window. He had moved so silently she hadn't even seen him approach. He stood beside them, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable, but his eyes fixed on the hand gripping Claire's wrist. The young man scoffed. "And who are you? Her knight in shining armor?" "I'm a guest who values common decency," the man replied, his tone unchanging. "Something you seem to be lacking. Let her go. Now." There was no threat in his voice, but the command was absolute. The young man, suddenly sobered by the sheer force of the man's presence, released Claire's wrist as if it were red hot. He mumbled something under his breath and turned away, his friends shuffling awkwardly behind him. Claire stood there, rubbing her wrist, her heart pounding. She looked up at her unexpected defender, 1,000 questions in her eyes. He simply gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning and walking away, melting back into the crowd as quietly as he had appeared. She took a shaky breath, the discreet gesture of an ally in a hostile world, leaving a far greater impact than the cruelty of her tormentors. She didn't know who he was, but in that moment, he had given her something she hadn't realized she'd lost, a sliver of her own dignity. Claire tried to steady herself, the adrenaline from the confrontation slowly receding, leaving her feeling shaky and exposed. She retreated to the relative anonymity of the service bar, her mind replaying the scene over and over. He had called her the lady, not the waitress, not her, but the lady. The simple word was a shield, a quiet declaration of her worth in a room where she had none. She busied herself polishing glasses that were already clean, needing a mindless task to occupy her hands. Who was he? He carried himself with an air of quiet power that made even the most arrogant guests back down. Yet he had used that power not to boast, but to defend her. It was a contradiction she couldn't comprehend. A little while later, as she was serving a tray of miniature desserts, she saw him again. He was in conversation with the party's host, a well-known city councilman. This time, Claire was close enough to hear their conversation. "Leo, my friend, I'm so glad you could make it," the host said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Your foundation's latest donation to the city arts program has been transformative." Leo. The name suited him. It was simple, strong. Leo smiled graciously. "The arts are the soul of the city, councilman. It's our duty to keep that soul alive." His voice was the same one that had defended her. Calm, measured and resonant with a depth that made people listen. Claire felt a strange pull, a desire to know more about this man who spoke of a city's soul while standing in a room that felt utterly soulless. As the host moved on to greet another guest, Leo's eyes found Claire's. He didn't smile, but his gaze was warm, an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared moment earlier. This time, Claire didn't look away immediately. She held his gaze for a heartbeat longer than she should have, a silent thank you passing between them. A blush crept up her neck, and she quickly turned to offer a dessert to a nearby guest, her hands not quite steady. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. Not as a uniform or a function, but as a person. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. In the gilded cage of the ballroom, a small window had just been opened, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for the light pouring in. Claire moved through the rest of the evening in a daze, her thoughts constantly drifting back to Leo. His quiet defense of her had been a small act, but in her world, it was monumental. It had chipped away at the armor of indifference she wore every night. Now she felt strangely vulnerable, as if a piece of her carefully constructed defenses had been removed, leaving her exposed to the cold judgment of the room. She tried to focus on her duties, on the rhythm of serving and clearing, but her mind was a whirlwind. You have dignity in every small gesture. His words echoed, a stark contrast to the sneers and dismissive glances she was so accustomed to. It was hard to believe they were genuine. As she was refilling champagne flutes at a side table, she overheard a conversation that made her pause. A group of women, draped in jewels that could have paid her mother's medical bills for a lifetime, were discussing the man who had captured her attention. "That's Leonardo Albuquerque," one of them whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and gossip. "He's notoriously private, inherited a fortune but spends most of his time on his philanthropic foundation. They say he's one of the most powerful, understated men in the city," another woman added, "and apparently, he has a soft spot for the serving staff." The comment was followed by a dry, knowing laugh. Claire felt a familiar sting of humiliation. Of course. To them, his kindness wasn't genuine. It was a quirk, a strange hobby. They were turning his act of decency into another piece of gossip, another way to mock her. She felt foolish for even daring to believe his words were sincere. He was from their world, after all. Why would he be any different? With renewed determination, she hardened her heart, telling herself it was all a game, and she was just a temporary pawn. She would finish her shift, collect her pay, and forget his name and his kind eyes. Later, as she was clearing plates from a table, she saw the group of young men who had harassed her earlier. They were standing near the grand piano, and as she passed, one of them deliberately bumped into her, not hard enough to make her fall, but enough to make her stumble. "Still clumsy, I see," he muttered, loud enough for his friends to hear. They snickered, their eyes glinting with malice. Claire ignored them, her jaw tight, and continued on her way. But this time, the humiliation felt sharper, amplified by the brief moment of hope she had allowed herself to feel. It was a painful reminder that in this world, kindness was a fleeting illusion. She was, and always would be, just the waitress. Her place was to be invisible, and she had been a fool to think, even for a second, that could ever change. The party was beginning to wind down, but the core group of wealthy, influential guests remained, their laughter echoing through the grand ballroom. Claire's feet throbbed, and a dull ache had settled in her lower back. She was counting the minutes until she could escape, shed this uniform, and return to her own world, a world where she wasn't invisible, but a daughter and a sister. As she balanced her heavy tray, she once again saw the group of young men who seemed to have made it their mission to torment her. They were now gathered near the exit, their voices loud and obnoxious. She mapped a route to avoid them, but her supervisor intercepted her. "Table 7 needs more water," she said curtly, pointing directly toward the group. Claire's heart sank. Taking a deep breath, she pasted on her professional smile and headed toward the table, her steps measured and cautious. As she leaned over to pour water, One of the men, the same one who had grabbed her wrist, made a lewd comment under his breath, just for her to hear. "You know, for a waitress, you're not half bad to look at. Bet you're lonely when your shift ends." Claire flinched, her hand trembling slightly as she held the heavy water pitcher. She felt trapped, cornered by their entitled smirks and the unspoken threat in their words. She wanted to pour the ice-cold water over his head, to wipe that smug look off his face. But she couldn't. She needed this job. Before she could retreat, something unexpected happened. Leo, who had been in a conversation nearby, excused himself and walked calmly toward the table. He didn't look at the men. He looked directly at Claire. "Excuse me," he said, his voice polite but firm. "I was hoping you could help me. I seem to have misplaced my coat check ticket. Would you be so kind as to escort me to the front desk?" It was a clear fabrication, a lifeline thrown to her in a sea of sharks. He was giving her a reason to leave, an escape route that wouldn't cause a scene or jeopardize her job. Grateful, Claire straightened up immediately. "Of course, sir," she replied, her voice filled with a relief so profound it was almost overwhelming. She placed the water pitcher on the table and turned to walk with him, leaving the group of men momentarily speechless. As they walked away, she could feel their glares on her back, but they were powerless. Leo's presence was a shield, his quiet authority more potent than their loud-mouthed arrogance. He didn't say a word about the incident as they walked. He simply created a space of safety for her. It wasn't a grand gesture of defense this time. It was a quiet, strategic act of solidarity. It was an unspoken alliance. And as they walked across the marble floor for the first time that night, Claire didn't feel like a servant being rescued. She felt like an equal. The grand finale of the evening was the host's toast. The lights dimmed slightly, and the string quartet began a soft, expectant melody. Guests gathered around the main stage, their champagne flutes held aloft. It was Claire's job to ensure every glass was full, a final frantic dance through the crowd before the night's official end. She moved with practiced efficiency, her tray a silver moon navigating a constellation of diamonds and silk. But her invisibility was gone. Since Leo had publicly allied with her, she felt the weight of curious, and in some cases, hostile stares. Her path inevitably led her back to the man who had become her chief tormentor. He stood with his friends, a smug, arrogant smile on his face. As Claire offered him a fresh glass, he took it, but not before, accidentally, knocking his empty one from her tray. It shattered on the marble floor with a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the music. A collective gasp went through the nearby crowd. "Clumsy girl," the man said loudly, a theatrical sigh in his voice. "Now look at the mess you've made. Can't you do anything right?" Laughter rippled through his group. The host on the stage paused, looking down with irritation. All eyes were on Claire. She felt 100 gazes on her, hot and heavy with judgment. Her face burned with a shame so intense it felt like a physical blow. Her supervisor was already rushing over, her expression furious. This was it. This was how she would lose her job. Instinct took over. She knelt, her knees hitting the cold marble, and began to pick up the larger shards of glass, her hands trembling. The sound of the shattering glass seemed to echo the shattering of her composure. She was on display, a spectacle of failure for their amusement. And here, I have to ask you, who are watching this story unfold? How many times have you been judged by your appearance or your job without anyone seeing who you truly are? Claire's pain is one that many of us have felt. If her story has touched you, please take a moment now to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It ensures you won't miss the powerful conclusion to her journey. Just as Claire felt her last ounce of hope disappear, a firm, deliberate footstep broke the silence. Leo emerged from the crowd. He walked past the host, past the gawking guests, and stopped directly in front of the man who had caused the scene. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and cold as steel. The man scoffed, but Leo's eyes, locked onto his, held a power that silenced him. "It's not anyone's job to be the target of your cruelty," Leo stated, his voice resonating in the quiet room. He then turned, walked over to Claire, and extended his hand. "Please, get up," he said softly. "You don't kneel for anyone." As Claire took Leo's hand and rose to her feet, the host, desperate to regain control of his party, decided to play his final card. He stepped onto the small stage, tapping the microphone with a nervous flourish. "Friends, friends," he called out, his voice overly cheerful. "It seems my guest of honor is eager to get involved tonight." A confused murmur spread through the room. "Guest of honor?" The host gestured dramatically toward Leo. "For those of you who don't know him personally, allow me to properly introduce him. This is Leonardo Albuquerque." The name hung in the air, charged with significance. Claire watched as expressions shifted around the room. The arrogant smirks of her tormentors faltered, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. The women who had gossiped about him now looked mortified. Leonardo Albuquerque wasn't just a guest. He was a name synonymous with immense wealth, influence, and, most importantly, a philanthropic empire that many in that very room sought favor from. He was the quiet power they all courted. "Mr. Albuquerque is not only a titan of industry," the host continued, trying to smooth over the tension, "but his foundation is the single largest contributor to our city's cultural and social programs. We are deeply honored to have him here." The puzzle pieces clicked into place in Claire's mind. The respect he commanded, the way people deferred to him, it all made sense. He could have ignored her, could have blended in with the rest of his class, but he had chosen not to. He had chosen to see her. Leo, however, seemed unimpressed by the grand introduction. His focus remained on Claire. He gently took the remaining shards of glass from her trembling hands and placed them on a nearby table. "You don't have to clean up their messes," he said again, his voice low and meant only for her, though the entire room strained to hear. The silence was deafening. The bully who had started it all looked pale, as if he might be sick. He had just publicly humiliated a woman who was now under the personal protection of one of the most powerful men in the city. The social calculus of the room had been irrevocably altered. Claire felt tears welling in her eyes, but for the first time that night, they weren't tears of shame or sadness. They were tears of overwhelming, heart-stopping gratitude. The laughter had stopped. The whispers had died. For the first time, she was not invisible. And Leo, standing before them all, had made it clear that he saw something in her that no one else had bothered to look for. The ballroom remained in a state of suspended animation. The orchestra was silent, the guests frozen in awkward tableaus of shock and embarrassment. The woman who had been invisible just moments before was now the undeniable center of the universe, shielded by a man no one dared to cross. The guests who had laughed at her expense now avoided her gaze, their faces a mixture of fear and shame. The man in the light-colored suit had vanished into the crowd, eager to escape the spotlight of his own disgrace. The power dynamics of the room had been completely upended. Claire stood beside Leo, her heart still pounding, but the frantic rhythm of fear had been replaced by a steady, powerful beat. She felt a strength she hadn't known she possessed. It wasn't his power that she felt, but her own. A dignity that had been there all along, now finally brought into the light. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people who had scorned her, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. She no longer felt small. Leo, sensing the shift in her, gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Claire deserves our respect," he said, his voice calm but carrying across the silent room. "And if anyone here disagrees, perhaps this isn't the right environment for you." His words were a final, quiet dismissal of the cruelty that had permeated the evening. The message was clear. The party was over for those who traded in humiliation. Slowly, the tension began to break. Some guests, deeply embarrassed, began to make their quiet exits. Others started talking in hushed tones, their conversations now revolving around the shocking display of character they had just witnessed. The host, looking pale, quickly signaled for the music to resume, a desperate attempt to reclaim a sense of normalcy that was long gone. Claire took a deep breath, the air feeling cleaner, lighter. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a woman who had been seen, who had been defended, and who had, in the process, found the courage to see herself. That night was no longer a story of her humiliation. It had become the story of her vindication. After the party finally ended, Claire was changing out of her uniform in the staff locker room when there was a soft knock on the door. It was Leo. He waited for her outside, away from the lingering stares of the other staff members. "I didn't mean to cause such a scene," he said, his expression sincere. "I just couldn't stand by and watch them treat you that way." Claire managed a small, genuine smile. "You didn't cause a scene," she replied, her voice steady. "You ended one. Thank you." He nodded, his eyes warm. "I meant what I said, Claire. You have a strength and dignity that is rare, which is why I wanted to ask you something." He paused, and for a moment, Claire's heart skipped a beat. "My foundation is launching a new community outreach program. We need people on the ground who are empathetic, resilient, and understand what it's like to be overlooked. We need someone like you. It's a real job with a real salary. Would you be interested in an opportunity to help others?" Claire was speechless. All her life, she had been told she was nothing. She had been trapped by circumstance, working tirelessly just to survive. Now this man was offering her not charity, but a chance. A chance to use her experiences, her pain, and her strength for something meaningful. It was more than a job. It was a validation of her entire existence. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I would love that." Leo's smile widened. "Good," he said. "Then this is just the beginning." As Claire walked out of the grand building and into the cool night air, she looked up at the stars. For the first time in a long time, her future didn't feel like a dark, uncertain path. It felt as bright and limitless as the city skyline before her. And now, I speak to you, who have followed this journey to its end. Like Claire, you may have felt invisible or underestimated. But never forget that your true worth is not defined by how others see you. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what part of Claire's story resonated with you. And don't stop here. Another inspiring story is already waiting for you on the channel. That night, Claire left behind the girl with the silver tray. She walked away as the woman who, after finally being seen, was ready to change the world.